I'm sorry, I'm going to have to call you to business almost immediately because we've eaten into some 10 minutes of the afternoon's time, quite rightly, but we must move on. Next item of business is the Finance and Constitution Committee debate on motion 18951 in the name of Bruce Crawford on its report on common frameworks. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Bruce Crawford to speak to and move the motion. Mr Crawford, 12 minutes or thereabouts, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by sincerely thanking my colleagues on the Finance and Constitution Committee for all of the significant work undertaken to help develop this unanimous report from the committee. So too, on behalf of the committee, I should thank the clerks, in particular Jane Williams, for all of their fantastic work in supporting the committee come to its conclusions. Last October, I had the pleasure, at least I think that's the right word, of making the first ever committee announcement to the Chamber when I explained to members about the Finance and Constitutions Committee's work on the important matter of common frameworks. Is it not therefore fantastic that all of the political journalists will be tuning in to this debate this afternoon? Common frameworks are where the UK and devolved governments have agreed to establish post-Brexit, if indeed it still happens, common approaches across the UK in policy areas such as justice, the environment, health, agriculture and fisheries, areas that are currently within the competence of the EU. Since my announcement, the committee has discussed agreement making with representatives from different tiers of government across Europe and the European Commission, as well as from stakeholders across the United Kingdom. All this activity has helped inform our report on common frameworks published on the 25th of March. And I'd like to thank all of whom we met with for so generously giving of their time and expertise. Now, in its fourth quarterly report in July this year, the UK Government confirmed that there are 78 policy areas where non-legislative common frameworks, such as memorandums and concordats, may be necessary to deliver common rules or ways of working in areas such as public procurement and energy efficiency. Additionally, there are then 21 policy areas such as agricultural support and food labelling where legislation may be needed in whole or in part alongside a non-legislative framework agreement. Finally, there are 4 frameworks where the competence is currently disputed between the UK and devolved governments, with state aid being one of these 4 areas. To date, however, we've only had one outline common framework published in the area of hazardous substances. This outline framework came with a caveat that it's not a suggested outline for initial UK or GB-wide framework agreement in a particular policy area. It is somewhat frustrating that over a year since the committee began its work, we've yet to see what a final common framework will look like. But on the upside, at least this means that our recommendations or report remain as relevant today as they were when they were published 6 months ago. As the Cabinet Secretary stated to us, common frameworks are not required for any specific EU exit day, but remain discrete long-term arrangements that are designed to be put in place post-Brexit. It would be helpful, nevertheless, if in responding to this debate, the Cabinet Secretary could update us on the timescales the Joint Ministerial Committee are working to for finalising frameworks. Turning to what frameworks will do, as the Joint Ministerial Committee explained, therefore enabling the proper functioning of a UK internal market, a concept we were not previously required to address while remaining in the EU, as well as, of course, ensuring that the UK can negotiate, enter into and implement new trade agreements and international treaties. They also help in the area of common resources and provide access to justice in cross-border areas. A framework, it is expected, will set out a common UK or GB approach, as well as how it will operate and be governed on the ground. It could consist of a minimum or maximum standards, harmonisation, place limits on action, or provide areas of mutual recognition. The JMC also confirmed that common frameworks will respect the devolution settlements and will maintain, as a minimum, the equivalent flexibility for tailoring policies as is currently the case. From that description, I think it's fair to say that common frameworks can be used for a lot of different reasons, will serve a range of purposes and may contain a range of information and potentially different approaches. This complexity, combined with the fact that common frameworks are subject to intergovernmental negotiations, will inevitably require confidentiality in some areas. That poses challenges for parliamentary scrutiny. Parliamentary scrutiny matters because it enables the public and stakeholders to have a say about the development of frameworks, and it helps aid the understanding and compromises governments may have to make in order to achieve agreement. It also provides a key test as to whether what governments think the framework will achieve is matched by actual lived experience, by those who legislate, or indeed those whose work is affected by that policy area. We set out in our report a comprehensive set of recommendations looking at all aspects of scrutiny of common frameworks. As our motion recognises, we see formal parliamentary scrutiny as crucial throughout the process, from development, agreement and implementation, and for both legislative and non-legislative frameworks. We welcome the Scottish Government's recognition of this, and it now falls to officials from the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament to develop what that scrutiny process will look like in practice. And the committee looks forward to considering their proposals in the near future. I'm heartened, however, that in the meantime, Scottish Parliament committees are continuing to monitor framework developments in their policy areas. And one of the principal challenges, Presiding Officer, facing us all across this chamber is the increasing complexity of devolution following any Brexit from the EU. In particular, the extent to which the constraints on devolved competencies arising from the UK's membership of the EU will differ following any Brexit. And if so, how such constraints will be agreed, and the role, crucially, for this Parliament in that process. For example, common frameworks, which may be voluntary arrangements between the Scottish and UK governments, may nevertheless constrain this Parliament's powers. Now, there may be good reason for doing so, but it's essential that that is done transparently and is not a solely executive-driven process. That complexity also means that, speaking frankly, it could be more difficult to identify the extent of constraints on the competencies of the Scottish Parliament and where they arise from. For example, whether they arise from common frameworks or from trade deals. Now, responding to the committee's concerns in this area, the Cabinet Secretary identified work done by the GMCEN to help, and I quote here, surface and map these types of interdependencies. I would welcome an update on that work, as well as whether the Scottish Government plans to provide a central, publicly available site where non-legislative and legislative agreements which interact between devolved and reserved areas can be found. This complexity also poses challenge for committee scrutiny. No longer will policy development be solely for the Scottish Government, but could be the result of frameworks or trade agreements agreed elsewhere, such as by the UK Government or indeed between governments. Following responses on this challenge from the Scottish Parliament committees and our counterpart committees at Westminster and the Welsh Assembly, the committee wrote to the UK and Scottish Government setting out a range of principles to provide a more coordinated approach to scrutiny. Those principles include providing sufficient time for scrutiny opportunities for public and stakeholder engagement and the ability to influence early on the development of common frameworks. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's positive response to our proposals and will soon see a process delivering such scrutiny arising from the work currently underway. Up to now, I've spoken about consensual common framework process. But as the Cabinet Secretary said to us, one of the challenges for governments working together is that the more that's written down, the less likely governments are to get agreement. As we heard in Brussels, a robust and trusted intergovernmental relation process is key to avoiding disputes. In the report, we note the UK approach to intergovernmental relations is currently under review by the JMC plenary. However, this review has been ongoing since March 2018 with no final completion date. Now, whilst a set of principles have been agreed recently, such as building trust, maintaining positive and constructive relations, and resolving disputes according to a clear and agreed process, a greater sense of urgency to complete this review is needed. I would welcome an update from the Cabinet Secretary, particularly on how much trust has now been established, as well as his views on whether he considers that the Intergovernmental Relations Review requires to be completed before common frameworks can be finalised. Now, Presiding Officer, time hasn't allowed me to do justice to all the recommendations in our report, but I know that others will highlight some of the other report themes in their contributions. But our work does not end there. Our next area of focus will be the issue of the internal market and what that means for Scotland. I again thank my colleagues for their hard work during the inquiry on common frameworks, and I really look forward to seeing our deliberations appear in the national media tomorrow. And in doing so, I move the motion S5M 18951 on behalf of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I call Michael Russell to open for the Government. 10 minutes, Mr Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I cannot but help notice and agree with Bruce Crawford's point that there are, in fact, double the number of people in the chamber who are actually in the gallery, and there are only 25 of us in the chambers now. So I don't think this will be setting the heather on fire, but that does not mean that it isn't an important debate to have, and particularly today, because the Scottish Parliament Committee has given a comprehensive and very useful report on the implications of EU exit for devolution and has undertaken very helpful scrutiny of post-Brexit work. Now, of course, the best means of ensuring the continued application of those principles in a UK setting is for Scotland and for the whole of the UK to remain in the EU. And of course, I do believe, and I agree with the First Minister, she said earlier, that Scotland's interests are best served by being an independent EU member state. And within that context, frameworks are not our choice, but they are an unfortunate necessity and one of the many constitutional consequences of Brexit, and many of those are very difficult to cope with. What we have here is something that has been able to build slowly, piece by piece. The Scottish Government remains wholly opposed to a no-deal exit, but we need to prepare Scotland for all eventualities, and in that spirit, we also need to prepare Scotland for any type of deal that takes place, even though we don't want it and won't support it, any type of deal, and the need to have working relationships as a result of that deal. Now, the JMC-EN principles, which the JMC-EN, that's a Joint Ministerial Committee, published, underpin the frameworks. Frameworks aren't complete, and I respond to the point that Bruce Crawford made in the early part of his speech. Frameworks aren't the whole deal, the real deal. They are literally the frameworks upon which we are hanging other things, which will in the end produce a complete picture of how we work together in certain areas. But all such frameworks, and this is a crucial issue for the Scottish Government, must be agreed, not imposed. And they must recognise and respect devolution. And we are only going to agree to frameworks when they are in Scotland's interests. And that's a normal thing for any country to do. We would only agree to things if we felt they were in our interests. Now, the quarterly reports from the UK Government on frameworks, which is part of the agreement that we have on building the frameworks, indicate that we are proceeding on, of course.
Adam Tompkins.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. If Scotland were ever an independent member state of the European Union, then Scotland would have to accept common frameworks, or the EU equivalent of common frameworks, even if Scotland had not voted for them in the Council of Ministers under the rules of qualified majority voting. Does the Minister think that there is a place for a sort of qualified majority voting, as has been suggested, for example, by the Welsh, in terms of the development of common frameworks in the United Kingdom after we leave the European Union?
Cabinet Secretary.
It is an interesting point, and I take it in the spirit in which it is made. I think, and I will come on to it in a moment, I think that the intergovernmental review, it would be essential to complete that and possibly to have that as part of the changes that to come about as a result of the governmental review, which would create a possible landscape in which that was a part. But as the UK government has not moved an inch on the intergovernmental review as yet, I think it's unlikely that they would concede to such a thing, let alone anybody else. But it is an interesting point, and I'll come back to it. I was making the point that the Section 12 reports, the quarterly Section 12 reports, so far have indicated that there is no need for legislation to impose frameworks. That is very welcome, but it is also essential, because we have made it clear at all times that if there is any attempt to use Section 12 powers, then we will cease to cooperate on that framework. And we're determined to ensure in this Parliament that new legislation tabled ensure that our law continues to align with EU law, no matter what the frameworks are, to maintain current standards and protections in key areas. And that is a crucial issue I'll come back to. Now, the point that Mr. Tompkins made about the IGR machinery is a key one, and there are 5 contextual points that I want to make about frameworks before I go into any more detail. The first is that the current intergovernmental framework is not, current intergovernmental relationship is not fit for purpose. Every body that has understood and studied this, from the House of Commons PACAC Committee, the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit, academic studies have said the current situation does not work. There needs to be a different situation. That is why the intergovernmental review was accepted by all parts of the JMC structure 18 months ago. Since then, the Welsh have published detailed proposals. We have proposals to make and will make them, but the UK government has brought nothing to the table. There was an agreement on principles at the end of June as a result of the meeting of the JMC in Manchester, the last one that David Liddington chaired, but those were published, those had been agreed a long time ago. So we need to get some progress. So the first thing is, I do not believe, and Bruce Crawford made this point, I do not believe we could establish a secure basis for frameworks unless the intergovernmental review was completed and there was an agreement on what the structure should be. And that also applies to any second stage of EU negotiations. It would be impossible to envisage a second stage of EU negotiations that did not have substantial changes in the relationships between the nations of these islands. Essentially, something I have said in the past, I remember Cadwyn Jones saying it too, I think Mark Drakeford has indicated it, Brexit has been too heavy for devolution to bear. The second contextual point is the phrase UK internal market, which we will hear today. We welcome the committee's unanimous view that it cannot be a pretext for adjusting devolution without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. It is also important to recognise there is no definition of the UK internal market, and the UK government has not provided one and cannot provide one. Thirdly, the shape of frameworks depends on a range of factors, not least future UK trade deals and the relationship with the EU. And we've repeatedly made a case for a guaranteed role for the Scottish Government and Parliament in future trade deals. Fourthly, it is absolutely essential that any frameworks are temporary in nature, preserve decision-making for Scottish ministers and respect devolution. And finally, that frameworks, the principles established on the expectation of substantial EU alignment, and this is the level playing field issue. If there is not to be a level playing field, then the frameworks are at severe risk, because the way in which the frameworks have been anticipated and planned is that there should continue to be the level playing field. And indeed, I will be writing to the UK government about that very shortly, and I know others share my concerns. So let me now just address where we are going. The process of agreeing frameworks must be transparent and inclusive. This Parliament must have the opportunity to consider and agree all frameworks. Many frameworks will have a mixture of legislation, primary and or secondary, and non-statutory agreements. So the scrutiny procedures need to reflect that. Since the committee reported in March, we have consulted extensively, and with Scottish Government officials have worked constructively with parliamentary clerks to consider how best scrutiny should take place. We're now in discussion with other administrations and legislators. And Mr. Crawford asked about timescale. We aim to have an agreed process in place before the end of the year, because the first frameworks are likely to be coming forward for scrutiny at that time. In the meantime, we add greater understanding of the scope of frameworks. We're looking about how they are placed in the public domain and what discussion we should have about them. And we do accept that stakeholders should have a central role in the design and implementation of the final stage of the frameworks and be able to test and refine them. I will continue to work with the Scottish Parliament committees to facilitate meaningful engagement on this, and that will include, of course, the Finance and Constitution Committee, which has been very constructive in this. There was an excellent event at the Royal Society last year. I think it's important that type of event continues. So the next steps are these. We will continue to develop the frameworks. It is a new and unprecedented process. It has competing priorities. There's huge uncertainty surrounding Brexit today, of all days, we know that, and the pressures of Brexit time. Frankly, at the moment in Whitehall, everything is in paralysis. But we will continue to try and bring them forward because we need to have them available to us should they be needed. I would rather they were not needed. I would rather this did not happen. But if they are needed, they will be there. We need to continue to address the issues of review, scrutiny and management. And I heard Mr Crawford's remarks about publication. I think those are important remarks and I'll bear them in mind. We have an opportunity today to influence the process by hearing people's views. I welcome comments and contributions from across the Chamber. We will take note of those and we will feed those into the dialogue we're having with the committees. But I also welcome the interest from across Scotland because I think in a very welcoming innovation today we're hearing the voices of others about what those frameworks should be. For example, the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Law Society of Scotland have both, I know, given their opinion. I don't agree with everything in them, but I very much welcome that input. I think we've got the opportunity today to talk about an issue that could be of importance. I stress, I hope in the end it isn't, but could be of importance, and consider this is the one area which we've been able to move forward on the Brexit negotiations constructively because we have done it on the basis of ensuring there is no imposition. And the UK government have not as yet pulled rank on anybody over this because they know they need this to be done by negotiation. Then we have made some progress. And we can probably make more progress if we need to, providing that spirit continues, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I call on Murdo-Fraser to open the Conservatives. 9 minutes, Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking the committee convener, Bruce Crawford, not just for his opening exposition of the background to this issue of post-Brexit common frameworks, but also for his stewardship of the committee and his constant striving to find consensus around what can be, on occasion, a contentious issue. And can I also thank my fellow committee members for their joint working in what is quite a complex area of law and of public policy. As we've heard already in this debate, the UK's departure from the EU will require the construction of common frameworks to enable the functioning of the UK internal market, or, as I might call it, the domestic market. Of the 111 powers returning to the UK, which fall within the devolved competence of the Scottish Parliament, a large number will be devolved straight to Holyrood. Another chunk will be subject to non-legislative common frameworks, which will need to be agreed. And in some 24 policy areas, there will be a need for legislative common frameworks. These will be mostly in the fields of environmental protection and agriculture and food production. There is no dispute in principle as to the need for these common frameworks. To give an example, whilst the law in an area such as food labelling might properly be devolved, I believe it is generally accepted that for the good operation of the UK domestic market, it makes sense to have single food labelling regulations that apply across the whole UK, this enabling Scottish food producers to sell their goods freely into all parts of the UK without having to worry about separate food labels. And of course, the opposite applies in relation to food producers from other parts of the UK looking to sell here. And inevitably, this means some sharing of power, or sovereignty, if you will, whereby at Holyrood we will voluntarily agree to share powers in certain areas for the greater good. Of course, there is nothing unusual in this concept. It is worth remembering, and this is a very important point, the powers we are talking about have never been exercised here previously. They were all previously held at an EU level, where it was understood that the EU would set rules for the better operation of the EU internal market. So by agreeing to common frameworks, we are not seeing any diminution of powers which are currently held by Holyrood, but rather a voluntary transfer of powers which would otherwise be coming here. Having accepted the necessity for common frameworks, the key issue the committee then had to address was how these might be agreed. And it was the clear conclusion of the committee, agreed unanimously, that the process for agreeing common frameworks and their content must be arrived at through agreement and not imposed. And indeed, the signs so far are that the work that is being done on common frameworks between officials in the UK government and in the devolved administrations has been on the basis of negotiation and agreement between governments without dispute. That said, it is clear that the opportunity for future dispute might well arise. There are a number of different players here. There is the UK government, which has a dual role in representing both the wider UK interest and also the specific interests of England. The Scottish Government, representing the interests of Scotland falling under the devolved competence, the Welsh Assembly having a similar position in Wales, and the Government of Northern Ireland, albeit that the Assembly there is currently in abeyance. Clearly, all parties want these common frameworks to be agreed on a consensual basis. And while there is no indication so far that that will not be the case, we do have to be alive to the possibility that agreement will not be able to be reached. I hope that all governments will be prepared to act reasonably and avoid this. But in the event of a dispute, how could any impasse be resolved? Would it be reasonable to give the devolved administrations an effective right of veto over rules which would affect the whole United Kingdom? Would this be seen as the tail wagging the dog? Now, Bruce Crawford referred to the review of intergovernmental machinery, and I think it's understood by everyone, not just here at Holyrood, but also by committees at Westminster, that what we currently have is not fit for purpose and does need to be improved. Within the EU, these disputes are effectively resolved through the Council of Ministers, in some areas requiring unanimous voting, in other areas operating a system of qualified majority voting. I have written in the past about how a UK Council of Ministers might operate, with the UK government and devolved administrations represented. The problem with this model at present is that there is no separate voice for England, distinct from that of the UK government. And if we were to have an effective Council of Ministers with any system of qualified majority voting, then that is something that would have to be looked at. These are effectively arguments for the future, although I do believe that the UK's departure from the EU will require us to look at the lacunas that exist in the British Constitution sooner rather than later. In the meantime, I remain firmly of the view that agreeing common frameworks by consensus should be the way forward. The committee recognised that there is scope for policy divergence across the UK when we are dealing with devolved responsibilities. We do need to be careful that policy divergence does not create a barrier to trade or competition. If we believe in the importance of the UK domestic market, a market which is worth 3 times more to Scottish producers than is the EU single market, then we should not want to see that disrupted. So post the return of these powers from the EU, I believe that all administrations in the UK need to act responsibly when considering policy changes. Because the starting point will be that there is no policy divergence. We are all inheriting the same rules from the EU, and it is only policy changes from the current status quo that are likely to present a challenge. Yes, of course.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way, but would you not accept that under the present system there is some policy divergence because at the moment there's a kind of common framework we have to agree to, but then we can go slightly different ways already?
Murdo Fraser.
Yes, I think that's a perfectly fair point that the member has made. Of course, what we're dealing with here is with powers currently held at EU level, and it's policy divergence in those powers that need to concern us, because they are the ones that might affect the operation of the UK domestic market post-Brexit. And I think that is really what the issue of common frameworks is seeking to address. But to give an example, in the area of environmental protection or food standards, there might be a political demand from various administrations to go down a different route to the one we currently have. And we need to be very cautious of the impact this will have on the UK domestic market. And how that market is defined is going to be essential to this process. And it was encouraging to hear that there is ongoing work in this area by the UK government, and the committee did agree it is essential that this respects the devolution settlement. The committee was encouraged to hear about the ongoing work that is being done to create these common frameworks, particularly at an official level. In each of the 24 areas under discussion, all of them have been subject to at least one standalone discussion session, with 7 areas benefiting from approximately 6 sessions, and in those 7 areas, an outline template agreement has been put forward, covering a range of governance issues. So good progress is being made, but it is clear there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And that takes me to my final point, Presiding Officer, which is the question of parliamentary oversight of these agreements. The committee was strongly of the view that the process for agreeing common frameworks is not solely a matter for governments, but must be subject to parliamentary scrutiny and must be inclusive. So this Parliament must have the opportunity to consider the approach to common frameworks currently being negotiated at governmental level, and there should also be the opportunity for input by relevant stakeholders. Legislative common frameworks will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny through the usual legislative procedure. But a different approach will be required to the non-legislative common frameworks. The Cabinet Secretary has recognised that the parliamentary role in relation to these is absolutely essential and that the Scottish Parliament should have the opportunity to consider and agree both legislative and non-legislative arrangements for common frameworks, and I was pleased to hear him repeat that pledge this afternoon. That's a very welcome agreement, and all parties have therefore agreed that Parliament should have a formal role in relation to the process for developing and agreeing and implementing these non-legislative common frameworks. As I said at the start, Presiding Officer, these are difficult and sometimes technical areas where we are dealing with concepts of a nature which have not been necessary for us to address over the decades when we have been members of the EU. It is encouraging that thus far we have seen a largely consensual approach, both from within the Parliament and also from the Scottish Government. I sincerely hope that this continues, as the continued smooth operation of the UK domestic market will be absolutely essential to Scottish business in a post-Brexit environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Fraser. I call on Alec Rowley to open for Labour. 8 minutes, please, Mr Rowley.
Presiding Officer, in opening this debate for Labour, I want to set out our position regarding the necessarily collaborative approach in relation to the process for developing, agreeing and implementing both legislative and non-legislative common frameworks. We believe that the work done so far on the development of common frameworks is welcome, but the lack of recent progress is worrying. Scottish Labour strongly agrees with the committee's report on the common frameworks that it must be arrived at through agreement and not imposed. We have yet to receive assurances that the new government of Boris Johnson will take this approach to the development of common frameworks. This is particularly worrying given the scope the UK-EU withdrawal bill gives the UK government to limit the transfer of devolved powers from the EU to Holyrood and Boris Johnson's recent attempts to undermine democracy. Indeed, the Royal Society of Edinburgh has stated that the UK government has identified 160 policy areas of EU law that intersect with devolved competencies. They go on to state that reports, including those from the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, indicate that there is a lack of coherence and coordination at a UK government level in relation to how common frameworks should be established, operated and monitored. The Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee has remarked that the current mechanisms for intergovernmental relations in the UK are not fit for purpose. It is clear that a more robust and transparent mechanism to facilitate intergovernmental working and progress on common frameworks in a way that respects the UK's devolution settlement is required. We therefore support the committee's call for the current review of intergovernmental relations to be taken forward urgently. Parliament and stakeholders must have a role in contributing to and scrutinising common frameworks, particularly given the possibility that some frameworks will be created without legislation. We agree that Parliament should have a formal role in development and implementation. The UK and devolved governments already have experience of managing policy divergence within the requirements of the EU internal market, underpinned by the principles such as subsidiarity and proportionality. A range of options were provided to committee by the Brexit and environmental academics as to how greater or lesser policy flexibility could be provided to enable individual jurisdictions to adopt their own policies while still supporting a common UK approach to its internal market. These options included exclusive power on the common position to rest with UK authorities, which would represent a rolling back of devolution. This is not the way to go, and Labour would want to see more devolution, not less. Other options, a legal arrangement whereby the devolved authorities contribute to and possibly even have a veto over the common position, but are obliged to implement it once in place, which is similar to the UK's current relationship with the European Union. A political agreement could be reached to follow the common position, meaning the legal competencies of the devolved authorities might not have to be restricted. The common position could be merely a recommendation with no political or legal fetters on the devolved authorities. The Parliament requires clarification from the Scottish Government on which of these approaches it's adopting and where it is willing to diverge from the UK Government to ensure that EU principles, further to the environmental principles, are enshrined in Scottish law. Scottish Environmental Link point out that currently 80% of our environmental protections in the UK stem from EU law and its institutions. They fear the loss of common EU standards as a result of the UK exit from the EU could potentially compromise the transition of Scotland and the UK towards a low-carbon, sustainable society through a race to the bottom on environmental standards. A collaborative and joint approach which respects the devolution settlement in the UK is needed to ensure environmental standards are protected and enhanced. Ambitious common environmental standards would ensure that there is no drive towards environmentally damaging competitive deregulation in any part of the United Kingdom. Labour believes that whether it is the environment or any other policy area, frameworks where required should be based on existing EU legislation, which should act as a common baseline on top of which individual countries can pursue more ambitious standards if they wish. Furthermore, in its discussion paper on Scotland's role in the development of future UK trade arrangements, the Scottish Government states that the UK analysis of the 111 policy areas that may be subject to common framework was compiled without consulting the Scottish Government and does not reflect an agreed position. That surely is an unacceptable position for this Parliament. Despite commitments from the UK and Scottish Governments that there is a role for Parliament to scrutinise common frameworks, this has not yet been visible in the approach adopted by the Joint Ministerial Committee. Legislative common frameworks will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny through the usual legislation procedures, which provide for greater transparency and stakeholder engagement. Yeah.
Cabinet Secretary.
I did mention in my remarks that there was considerable activity between the Scottish Government and parliamentary clerks about involving Parliament in scrutiny. So whilst he may have read the papers and minutes from the JMC, there has been action here by the Scottish Government and by the Scottish Parliament in terms of that.
Alec Rowley.
Well, that's to be welcomed, and we should certainly hopefully see more progress on that. The committee concluded that the non-legislative approaches, however, do not provide an automatic right for parliamentary consideration, and amendments either during development or once agreed, which could mean Parliament being presented with the equivalent of a fait accompli, with little scope to influence or test the compromise that have been made in order to secure the agreement. Given some of the powers that Scottish ministers sought to afford themselves through the Continuity Bill and now through the Referendum Bill, Parliament must be able to scrutinise the development and implementation of common frameworks. The Cabinet Secretary stated that in the event of the UK leaving the EU without a deal in place, it was unclear what the UK internal market would be. Scottish Labour, and I hope everyone in this Parliament believes, that the UK should in no circumstances leave the EU on a no-deal basis. I hope that that will be the outcome from Westminster in the coming days, and I look forward to us moving beyond this situation.
Thank you, Mr Rowley. I now call on Patrick Harvey to open for the Green Party. Mr Harvey, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to echo Bruce Crawford's thanks to everyone who contributed to the committee's work on this subject. It's worth, I think, noting that the context has changed somewhat since we began this work. When we began looking at this topic, the Brexit crisis had only reached round about DEFCON 3, I think. Things have moved on some way, not least with today's news. But they've moved on in a way which I think underscores the importance of some of the committee's conclusions rather than making them in any way less relevant. If the UK leaves the European Union, then it's clear that common frameworks will be needed. But it is also clear, clearer now than ever before, that trust and goodwill are inadequate. They cannot be relied upon as the basis for arriving at those common frameworks. We will need clear, defined and accountable processes for developing them, agreeing them, monitoring them and revising them. Because let's remember that simply agreeing a common framework, we may reach consensus about it on day one, but consensus can change. Politics can change, circumstances can change, and those common frameworks themselves will also need to change over time. There have been comparisons made with the European Union during this debate already, with the Council of Ministers and the Commission. But it's important to remember that those bodies are intergovernmental bodies. The Council of Ministers has direct representation of member states on it. The Commission is comprised of people who are nominated by member states. The UK is not an intergovernmental body. The UK government is not intergovernmental in the sense of representing in a fair and democratic manner the constituent parts of the UK. It continues with the delusion that the UK is a unitary state. It never was, but a great many people in Whitehall and Westminster seem to think that it is and behave that way. Now, the simplest option for me, it seems, to achieve common frameworks, if indeed this Brexit scenario does come to pass, is what we have now, devolution. And it's been done before. As the committee heard, a decade ago, for example, we were debating marine spatial planning. A complex area with many different policy objectives, some of which are in tension with each other, many different stakeholders and interest groups, and a range of devolved and reserved competencies. And we didn't have the language of common frameworks. We didn't use that jargon of common frameworks at the time. But what happened through discussing the policy objectives, through legislating separately in the two parliaments, was the emergence of what you could reasonably call a common framework. I think that would have been a lot less likely to achieve the degree of agreement that was reached if, in fact, one of those governments, the UK government, had been threatening to overrule and impose a solution if consensus wasn't reached. Consensus has to be meaningful, and it can't be meaningful if one party is holding a big stick during the discussions. Now, I use marine spatial planning as an example because there are a great many environmental aspects of the debate that we're going to be having, just as there are with the implications of trade agreements. If trade agreements are reached and they contain implications about the application of devolved responsibilities, or they impinge on devolved responsibilities, then it is absolutely and should be the right and the requirement and the responsibility of this Parliament as well as the Scottish Government to be deeply involved in the development of negotiating mandates, agreement of draft texts, finalising the agreement before it is ultimately signed off. And there's a huge number of other areas which, if we weren't talking about Brexit, we could be making progress on what you might still call common frameworks on things that cut across devolved and reserved competencies like data privacy. A great many other issues that we could be making that progress on, but we're not because of the energy that's being taken up by Brexit. And although all of that energy and focus is being taken up by Brexit, here we are more than 6 months after the first planned Brexit day, and we're still at the point of trying to figure out a way through this debate on common frameworks. We don't have a resolution to the fundamental questions involved. And for me, they're very similar to the debates about legislative consent that we've had. The principle of legislative consent has not been respected through this process. For consent to be meaningful, it has to be informed, it has to be freely given or withheld, it has to be revocable at any time, and fundamentally it has to be respected. These same principles, I think, must also apply to the development and agreement of common frameworks. And where consensus and agreement can't be reached, as Murdo Fraser was asking, where agreement and consensus can't be reached, we will be making, democratically accountably, a decision to accept the consequences of not having that agreement. And let's not kid ourselves, the internal market of the UK is not an absolute. We already regulate things like alcohol sales differently. We regulate, tax and register things like land and property transactions differently. There are differences in the way that those matters are dealt with. Fundamentally, Presiding Officer, if we are to remain in the UK, and if Brexit can't be stopped as it should be, we will need a constitutional arrangement which rebalances power, preventing the UK from abusing its power and imposing its will. As long as it holds that power, fair negotiation cannot happen, and we will be less likely to achieve the agreement and consensus that many people are arguing is necessary.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. And I call Willie Rennie to over the Liberal Democrats. 6 minutes, Mr Rennie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Some may say this debate is pointless. I hope that it is. Because if we stop Brexit, we won't have to have any of this. I don't actually agree with it. And Adam Tompkins is right, because we do need to reform our decision-making processes across the United Kingdom. So we do actually need to have this debate. But Brexit abolition might make it slightly easier, might have a bit longer time to decide it and make it better. Adam Tompkins, I'm sure, doesn't agree with that. But we do need to make a change. And I am very pleased to support the recommendations in this report. Common frameworks will be required, arrived at through agreement, and with robust intergovernment relations, especially dispute resolution. These are exactly the principles of a federal United Kingdom that I have been articulating for many years. People often attack us and say that we have not got very far in 100 years. Then you turn to this report and you find out that there's more and more people supporting our ambitions for a federal United Kingdom. And I notice Murdo Fraser is smiling because I know he wants a federal United Kingdom as well. Member takes an intervention.
Mr Fraser, that's a call to arms if ever I heard one. Mr Fraser.
I'm very grateful to Mr Rennie for giving way. Does he share my regret in all the years of the coalition government, when the Liberal Democrats were right there at the heart of the administration with the position of Deputy Prime Minister held by Mr Nick Clegg? They did absolutely nothing to advance the cause of a federal UK.
Mr Rennie.
Well, I would love to agree with him, but the forces of conservatism got in the way. They were desperate to keep the House of Lords and stop voting reform and any other kind of reform. So if only they would listen to Murdo Fraser, we may have got a little bit further along the path. But the Royal Society of Edinburgh has actually made it clear that this is a constructive development of these ideas around federalism. So people should take hope that there is a much more positive future available compared with the divisions of the current debate, or simply returning to the Britain of the past. Because federalism is not just for Brexit. We do need to make changes for the long term as to how Britain makes decisions in areas of common interest. But I should recognise that there is still a long way to go. As an example, in the UK's case, I look back to the publication of the UK Industrial Strategy in 2017. It was a strategy that cut across devolved areas. I would have hoped that a strategy would be prepared and agreed between the administrations in advance of its publication, rather than imposed by the UK government. But it wasn't. An industrial strategy that links the UK's single market, its international trade together with the skills and economic development roles of the devolved governments would have been stronger. So that's a mark down for the United Kingdom. In terms of framework agreements, I think back to the passage of the Continuity Act, which had a section very much focused on the future frameworks. My colleagues, including Tavish Scott, tabled amendments to set up a federal structure for agreement. My colleagues were very adamant that we needed to make those changes. We said that if all three other administrations objected strongly to an approach that the Scottish Government was taking, then it should be harder for Scottish ministers to get their plans through. Though through that we would be able to protect the workings of the UK single market against what would be, in effect, unilateral action by a single administration. It represents a federal idea of cooperation. It contrasts with the other proposals that give control of these issues entirely to UK ministers. Of course, Scottish Government objected to that. It surely cannot be right, is what they said. They wanted agreement by the Scottish Government to any changes. And my fear is when the Scottish Government, and Mike Russell did this himself today, when he talks about agreement and involvement of the Scottish Government, I hear sometimes veto in those circumstances. And I don't think we want, in common areas of interest, some kind of veto to be applied in those circumstances. I would call our proposals a form of qualified majority voting. They would foster an atmosphere of cooperation. There is a common set of standards and rules across the UK that enable businesses to expand across the UK without worrying that they have entered into a separate jurisdiction. The point I have made before is that to be successful, people with a federal system need to know that everyone has an eye and a care for the success of the whole. And that is where I have to keep up work with the arguments for a federal United Kingdom. I would just repeat what I've said many times to the SNP before. If you attack those who want to cut the UK from the EU and all the businesses and social opportunities that that offers, then don't be surprised that when people like me question how your plans to do the same to Scotland and the rest of the UK won't be damaging as well. The UK government might not want a federal UK, but nor does the SNP government. We can have a different, better future for Scotland as part of a reformed United Kingdom. That is a future that is better for our prosperity and well-being. This report and its recommendations make a strong case for that.
Well said, sir. Go on, Thank you, Mr Rennie. Open debate, speeches of 5 minutes, unless individual members have had a previous agreement from the presiding officer to have a longer period, cutting out, making shorter speeches for other members in their group. I hope that's clear, because Mr Mason, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Followed by Alexander Burnett, who's got 5 minutes. Yes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you very much to my colleague Gordon MacDonald, who gave me one of his minutes. Having only just joined the Finance Committee after this report was written, I am still happy to take part today and make some comments about it. It strikes me, perhaps this follows on quite well from what Willie Rennie has been saying, that a fundamental weakness of the UK is that there is no written constitution. Therefore, proper democracies like Germany and the United States have an agreed framework which may not be perfect, but which sets out in writing the relationship between central government and the state governments, between the respective governments and their parliaments, and also perhaps between the different parliaments. While you would not want to be at court on a regular basis, and I have to say I wrote this before today, at least that is always an option in the background. And perhaps this focuses minds when negotiations are taking place. It also means that no one part can control or bully the others. But each party can go to an independent organisation if all else fails. By contrast, the UK has no written constitution. And some might feel that that is a good thing and allows flexibility and gradual evolution to take place. However, it does result in a lack of clarity, and that is the position we find ourselves in now. Moving on to the report itself, I am sure speakers will focus on different parts. Therefore, I will just touch on a few which particularly struck me as a relative newcomer to the details of all of this. In the introductory paragraphs, reference is made to the Joint Ministerial Committee of October 2017 and the resultant communique. Paragraph 5 states how frameworks will respect the democratic settlements and the democratic accountability of the devolved legislatures. Of course, the UK government itself has changed since then, and I just wonder how much we can depend now on the statements that were made at that time. In particular, it was said that the competence of the devolved institutions will not normally be adjusted without their consent. And I just wonder what normally means. Could the current UK government be considered to be acting normally? It also says that we have to maintain equivalent flexibility for tailoring policies, as is afforded by the current EU rules. And I wonder how we are convinced by that. And it says that it must lead to a significant increase in decision-making powers for the devolved administrations. So here we are 2 years further down the line, and I wonder if we have actually seen any evidence of this happening. The committee makes the point in paragraph 22 that both the process for agreeing common frameworks and the actual consent must be arrived at through agreement and not imposed. And again, I have to say I'm a bit sceptical as to whether this will be the case. I think paragraph 66 is also important. It refers to frameworks being developed on an interim basis, which could make a lot of sense, but the risk would be setting precedents that it could be difficult to unravel. It also mentions, quote, pragmatic and practical arrangements, unquote, being required in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Again, I would be concerned that decisions could be railroaded through by a UK government without adequate Scottish Government input and even a lack of Scottish parliamentary scrutiny. One of the final paragraphs is 189 in the conclusion of the report, and it stresses that a robust and trusted process of intergovernmental relations is vital to agreement making, and that must include a process for dispute resolution. There seems to be broad agreement that the Joint Ministerial Committee has not been working and needs to be improved if there are to be more effective intergovernmental and interparliamentary mechanisms to examine common frameworks and to deliver greater transparency. As an aside, on Thursday this week, we are due to debate the Scottish National Investment Bank, and I was reading the Government's response of 26 August to the Economy Committee's Stage 1 report. In reference to state aid after Brexit, it states that the Competition and Markets Authority will rule on this topic. And although the CMA may not be perfect, and we will need to keep an eye on it, at least that does give a potential model of an independent body to rule on UK-wide issues. This is a point which the Royal Society of Edinburgh also took up in their briefing for today's debate. They refer to the absence of a clear institutional body or arrangement which could facilitate development and oversight of common frameworks. So they propose creating an independent secretariat body, and I think that would also be worth looking at. Paragraph 190 also makes some interesting points. Parliaments are there to scrutinise governments, but other stakeholders need to be involved too. For both primary and secondary legislation, there are relatively clear procedures in place, but it is maybe more difficult when it comes to non-legislative frameworks. If a deal is done by the two governments in a closed session, how does anyone scrutinise that? This kind of thing has happened, for example, with the block grant adjustment, when the respective ministers have agreed to split the difference. But that is difficult, if not impossible, to scrutinise. Scottish Environment Link, I thought, gave us a very helpful and briefing, and I would agree with a number of the points they make. Alec Rowley has already referred to part of that. But the idea that nature and environmental challenges often cross borders and so cannot be tackled by one country on its own. We want environmental standards that can be protected and enhanced, not drawn down. So in conclusion, presiding officers, there's a lot of uncertainty around this topic. I commend the Finance Committee for all its work before I joined it, and I would finish by quoting the Royal Society of Edinburgh again when they say, common frameworks should be no more intrusive than they need to be to serve their purpose when they overlap with devolved competencies. Thank you.
Alexander Burnett, followed by John McAlpine. 5 minutes, please, Mr Burnett.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, with the UK set to leave the European Union at the end of October, I am grateful that the committee has the opportunity today to speak in the Chamber on its conclusions and recommendations from its most recent report. And I'd like to note that the Scottish Conservatives are the only party who support many new powers coming back to the Scottish Parliament, because every other party in here would prefer for these powers to remain under the control of the European Union. So I am delighted that this Parliament will be strengthened with a wealth of new powers. And I'm hopeful that this and the future Scottish Government will take advantage of the opportunities they provide. Now, as the MP of a constituency that covers sectors from oil to farming, I am keen to ensure that common frameworks facilitate a positive transition for all businesses, no matter what they may be. And at this point, I'd note my members to my register of interest that may be affected by common frameworks. Now, the National Farmers Union of Scotland says regulatory differences must be limited and believe that it is imperative that the effective functioning of a UK single market is maintained. And therefore, regulatory differences must be limited. And commonly agreed regulatory regimes will also be essential in the negotiation of beneficial future trade deals, both with the EU and other partners. Now, it's important to note that the UK government is seeking to ensure that the Scottish Parliament is one of the world's most powerful devolved legislatures. So, with the launch of a review to improve the functioning of the devolved settlement, an increase of the Scottish Government's budget by over £500 million in real terms, and new powers already having been passed to Scotland on welfare, oil and gas and taxation, it is clear that the UK Government is doing their utmost to deliver this. However, it is disappointing, though unsurprising, that the SNP government continues to try to negate these positive moves with actions such as the Continuity Bill. Now, this bill not only created a waste of valuable parliamentary time, while crucial health legislation was delayed to accommodate it. I have no doubt that it will have frustrated my constituents to know that we were forced to waste precious hours on a bill that was ruled as incompetent by the Supreme Court. And yet the SNP are still trying to resurrect the Continuity Bill in their most recent programme for government. In fact, the SNP are still trying to hand powers back to the European Union through this bill. So for a party who pleads to voters to become independent, it baffles many that they are so keen to hand power back to an institution where we constitute less than 1% of elected members. Now, we must take advantage of the fact that this Scottish Parliament will gain powers in areas such as forestry and carbon capture, industries in which many of my constituents work and depend upon. And for us to take advantage of these powers would mean we could ensure that our laws have as positive an impact as possible on our constituents' livelihoods and businesses. So it should not be mistaken. The UK government has presumed devolution for the returning of powers from the EU. And the SNP's own MPs have admitted this as well, with Pete Wishart stating that nobody has claimed powers were being removed from the Scottish Parliament. The UK government are not seeking to take any powers away from the Scottish Parliament. They want to ensure that while frameworks are being agreed, there is the presumption that powers returning from the EU sit at a devolved level. Because I mentioned earlier, frameworks are vital in order to protect the UK single market. Our UK single market is 3 times more important to Scotland than the EU single market. Scottish exports to the UK are worth nearly 50 billion, against just under 15 billion to the EU. And we must build and strengthen this market. The SNP should be mindful of their hypocrisy when stating that when these powers are temporarily held at Westminster, it is an outrage, yet when the same powers are permanently held in Brussels, it is pooled sovereignty. So we should take advantage of these restored powers for Scotland, and I look forward to working with members in the committee in order to maximise the opportunities ahead. Thank you.
Joan McAlpine for 6 minutes, please, followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate today and congratulate the Finance and Constitution Committee for the very helpful report into this complex area of law. I wish this debate was not necessary. The majority of my constituents wish to remain within the European Union, and that is the case, of course, across Scotland. This discussion regarding common frameworks is predicated on the assumption that Brexit goes ahead. I don't want that to happen. Scotland doesn't want it to happen. And after today's Supreme Court judgment, well, who knows what will happen. Nevertheless, we must plan for the worst, and developments since the 2016 referendum make it clear that common UK frameworks are only one part of the significant adjustment that is required into how our governments will work together. The Scottish Government's call for a genuine relationship of equals between governments is absolutely correct, with adjustments taking account of the realities of devolution That must be the baseline from which common framework negotiations should progress, and anything less is not in Scotland's interests. We have seen the UK Government able to pay lip service to the devolved governments in the Brexit process, and there appears to be a recognition that a process overhaul is required to meet the needs of devolved governments going forward. For common frameworks to succeed, however, governments and parliaments must work together, but the precedents for this are poor. Parliamentary committees across the UK consider the Joint Ministerial Committee (JMC) mechanism not fit for purpose, and the Interparliamentary Forum in Brexit has calls for more effective intergovernmental mechanisms to examine common frameworks to deliver greater transparency. It appears to be accepted across the political divide that the current mechanisms for working together are simply inadequate. However, it appears the UK Government's review of intergovernmental relations, as others have said, has stalled. Why this is so is not clear, but it compounds constitutional chaos and stores up problems for devolved governments. I want to say that I welcome at this point the committee's finding that there is no definition of the UK internal market. The committee heard from Professor Michael Keating that the EU single market was not about particular competencies but a broad set of principles. Professor Keating pointed out to the committee that nothing like these mechanisms exists in the UK or in relation to devolution, yet there may be instances, in his view, in which the internal market principle could impinge on devolution. In my view, there's been a considerable degree of bad faith in the term internal market. It's used to attack the different policy choices across the UK and potentially justify a post-Brexit power grab. Devolution already allows quite wide divergence in policy. One thinks of minimum alcohol pricing and indeed our new tax powers that deliver considerable differentiation across these islands, but in no way interferes with our ability to trade freely across these islands. I also want to agree with members who have emphasised the importance of consent in all matters regarding common frameworks. Democracy is not served by the retention of Section 12 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, and I therefore call upon colleagues around the Chamber to support its repeal. Section 12 allows UK ministers to freeze Scotland's power to legislate in areas which are established as devolved. That is why this Parliament refused to give legislative consent to the 2018, and that is why this Parliament was right to do so. In an ideal world, Scottish ministers, indeed all of us, would be confident that Section 12 powers would never be used by the UK Government, and they have not been to date. But agreement in recent framework negotiations is no guarantee. Consent sought is not the equivalent of consent granted, and that's why Section 12 should be struck off if we are to proceed with the negotiation of common frameworks across these islands in good faith. Thank you.
Neil Bibby, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The decision of voters in the 2016 referendum to leave the European Union has caused political shockwaves, anger and division, along with confusion and uncertainty. As this debate takes place and with the UK Supreme Court making its historic judgment today, there is no obvious sign of the political confusion coming to an end. Many of us don't want the UK to leave the EU, and it's still possible that we don't. However, it would be remiss of this Parliament not to plan what may happen should the UK leave the EU. I commend the report of the Finance Constitution Committee on Common Frameworks. It's both timely and relevant, and it reflects the usual high professionalism from our committee clerks and convener and the insightful contributions we received from our first-class witnesses. At first sight, the topic may appear to be dry and anodyne, the sort of issue that excites only Ananacs. But we must stop for a moment to think what is involved if the UK leaves the EU. A large swathe of powers currently held by the EU will be repatriated and will naturally fall within the competence of the UK Government and Parliament. But equally, a large number where EU and devolved law overlap will pass by default to the devolved institutions. However, as members have said, given the number of areas where UK common frameworks will be needed, then it's clear that we need a robust and clearly understood protocol for ensuring these frameworks are in place. It would be unacceptable for the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament not to play a full and equal part in determining matters which have a devolved competence or implication. That is why it's right for the committee to continue to robustly defend the rights of the Scottish Parliament. As Murdo Fraser said, it's generally accepted that there are issues normally falling within a devolved competence that will, after Brexit, require some UK-wide alignment, for example, food labelling and others, where it makes no sense for a Scottish policy framework to be in outright conflict with the policy in the rest of the UK. I know the Scottish Government have recognised this since 2016, and like Alec Rowley, I agree with the Scottish Government that this should be a matter for negotiation and agreement, not imposition. Presiding Officer, I welcome any progress that has been made to date, but I remain of the view that the Joint Ministerial Committee is not fit for purpose. Something entirely new is needed. Members have mentioned the Welsh Labour Government's proposals, and I believe they are in need of serious consideration. We need something that is more robust, but also one where respect is central to the process. We need something which is more transparent in its operation. That's why the committee has called, rightly, for the current review of intergovernment relations to be taken forward as a matter of urgency. But there also has to be a note of caution. This is not about giving the Scottish Government a blank cheque. This Parliament has to be given its place. Stakeholders must have a role in contributing to and scrutinising common frameworks. I welcome what the Minister has said about progress being made in that area, but recent experience suggests that both Scottish Parliament and stakeholders need to be vigilant. We only need to look at some of the powers Scottish ministers have sought to afford themselves in the Continuity Bill and the Scottish Government's Referendums Bill, for example. So yes, transparency is required from the UK in its dealings with the Scottish Government, but so too must there be transparency from the Scottish Government in its dealings with the Parliament and stakeholders. It's clear that in this whole process there needs to be transparency, openness and respect from top to bottom. Common frameworks must be arrived at through agreement. We cannot have the UK Government usurping devolved powers, nor can we have the Scottish Government signing off agreements with the UK without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, without engagement with our stakeholders. There are worrying signs from the new UK Tory Government that it is prepared to play fast and loose with the law and conventions. Sharp practice needs to be stripped out of any approach to common frameworks. I want to finish by saying change is needed. We do need to change the Joint Ministerial Committee process. We also need to change attitudes and practice. There is a danger that if we get this wrong, then we could strengthen ministerial powers either at UK or Scottish Government level at the expense of parliamentary scrutiny. There is too much at stake for us to get this wrong, particularly in such troubled and unsettling times, and I commend again the committee report.
Stuart Stevenson, followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a shame Willie Rennie's temporarily out of the chamber, because on the 24th of May 1926, Herbert Asquith appointed the Welsh wizard Lloyd George to solve the problem of Home Rule in Ireland. Well, that went well. The Liberals might have been on the case for 100 years, but we haven't seen very much delivered on it. However, one of the first things I'd like to say is that if my time as a minister 10 years and more ago taught me anything, it's that the jurisdictions in these islands can work together very well when they require to do so. There are actually arrangements that existed in my ministerial responsibilities where I did actually have the right of veto, exercised responsibly on one occasion, and you never heard about it in Parliament because you didn't need to. I found myself signing off the sale of land in Birmingham on one occasion because British Canal Waterways Board was a cross-border authority. So we can work perfectly well. I also was, on behalf of the UK, the minister who for 3 days represented the UK at the Polish Government Economic Conference. So plenty of opportunities in case history working together. We sometimes hear rather more about the difficult areas. Now, this is an excellent report by the committee, and I commend it as others have. Just looking to one or two areas within it. Looking at paragraphs 42 and 43, essentially on different approaches that there might be in relation to the environment. Well, that's perfectly reasonable because the geography and the climate north and south of the border might be different and need different solutions. We were in committee this morning talking about invasive species. Well, the nature of that problem in Scotland is different, perhaps, from that in England or Wales. So it's not too surprising that there might be rather different solutions. We've heard quite a lot from various colleagues across the Parliament on all political persuasions about the role for Parliament, and I broadly agree with the way that Murdo Fraser characterised the need. It's one of the areas that the committee dealt with most particularly. They have 6 paragraphs that relate to recommendations, and we say, ending by saying we recommend Parliament should have a formal role in relation to the process, etc. And I find myself quite content to support that. Now, there's also, when we look at the development of common frameworks, paragraph 172, there's reference to the need to involve external stakeholders in certain parts of the compliance mechanisms that relate to common frameworks. And indeed, I would go a little bit further and say, let's just look at some of the requirements of stakeholders. And my constituency interests and my parliamentary interests on committee take me to both fisheries and agricultural support. And perhaps dealing with agricultural support first, it's not surprising that we need to have different implementations of the EU common framework, and would expect to have different implementations of a UK-wide common framework. Because in Scotland, 85% of our farming land is less favoured areas, whereas in England, 85% of their farming land is not. Only 15% is. So therefore, the geography and the nature of the land that is farmed necessitate different solutions, both in legislative and administrative and regulatory terms, but also in the financial structures of support that there are for industries in the agricultural sector. On fisheries, well, we have the Sea of Opportunity. I led a debate on that in this subject not long after the 2016 referendum, where we're clearly going to be in a position where we've got the opportunity, or if we depart the common fisheries policy, of controlling what goes out to 200 miles. But we can't forget that Scottish registered fishing boats will fish in other nations' waters, in English waters, Norwegian waters, and elsewhere. So therefore, we need a set of rules that apply to our interests that may be somewhat different from those south of the border, where shellfish are one of the most important things. So there's nothing unusual in requiring different solutions to different jurisdictions, but agreeing within a common framework what we need to do. Let me just close, Presiding Officer, by saying that one of the important things about common frameworks is not just about the rules, it's about funding streams. One of the things the common agricultural policy gives us is, for 5 or 6 or 7 years ahead, a view of what the funding is going to be like. We need a similar degree of certainty in these policy areas in particular, and I hope that we will find a way to achieve that. Presiding Officer.
Gordon Lyndhurst, followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As others before me in this debate, I would like to commend the work of the committee, and in particular that of Bruce Crawford, for his leadership on this issue. This is and will continue to be vital to Scotland's economy in the world post-Brexit. The need for common frameworks has, as my colleague Murdo Fraser mentioned, been accepted across this chamber and has largely managed to be dealt with above party political disagreement. So it is welcome news that the committee has also recommended that this chamber have a greater role in scrutinising such frameworks. Frameworks, of course, matter because they apply not only to our trade with Europe in general, but have and will continue to shape the prosperity of our own internal market, our trading relationships with the EU, and indeed every other state. And believe me, there is, of course, a world far greater than just that part of it, which is the EU. It is vital that we maintain the integrity of the common market across the United Kingdom. This is a view shared by many representative bodies across our commercial, manufacturing and services sectors. The Scottish Retail Consortium is just one of a chorus of interests which support proper, consistent and deliberate cooperation across all 4 home nations. However, we do find ourselves in unfamiliar territory. 87 new powers will be immediately devolved to this chamber, The remaining 24 are to be handed over to in the aftermath of any agreed-upon transition period. This has been aided greatly by the UK Government's acknowledgement in their revised frameworks analysis that of 162 policy areas which will require attention in dealing with Brexit's legislative effects in the devolved assemblies, there are only 21 in which future legislation may be required alongside non-legislative frameworks or potentially a consistent approach to retained EU law. I would entirely agree with the Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell's approach that frameworks operate based on mutual cooperation and established relationships. Indeed, it will be important when powers are newly realised by this Parliament that both legislative and non-legislative frameworks are properly considered. Constitutionally, such cooperation and the mechanisms for resolving disagreements or conflicts of interest are indeed very important. That decision-making and arbitration processes are also fully deliberated upon is equally vital. I would venture that it is Conservative values which are driving forward work to transfer new and old areas of the law to this Parliament. The Scottish Government's budget is to increase by over £500 million in the next financial year, while in 2020 Scotland will receive £1.2 billion in Barnett consequentials. This is the behaviour of a supportive UK Government that wishes to invigorate Scotland's Parliament in setting standards and enabling the economy. But just because power is to be newly repatriated from the EU, those powers should not be used just for power's sake. Scotland's trade with the other home nations still ranks as 3 times greater than that with the EU, sitting at a not inconsiderable £48.9 billion last year. Indeed, Professor Jim Gallagher has compelled the Scottish Government to maintain the integrity of the UK's common market on the grounds of it being simple economic common sense. It is vital, therefore, that these frameworks and the repatriation of power are approached in a good-natured and constructive fashion, as only then will the full potential of our country's economy and trading strength be realised. The Scottish Parliament will continue, as we know, to be one of the most powerful devolved legislatures in the world. The Scotland Act 2016 means that the Parliament has gained and maintained powers over issues from energy to tax and welfare. It is time now for the Scottish Government to put an end to its constant attempts to create constitutional crises between the UK and Scottish Parliaments on devolution. Let the people see us work constructively going forward.
Caught me by surprise there, Mr Lyndhurst, that sudden finish. Call now, please, Jenny Ruth, followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am not a member of the Finance and Constitution Committee, but nonetheless the content of the report on common frameworks should be of importance to all members. So may I add my thanks to all members who were involved in the report and to the committee clerks as well. At the time of the report's publication in March, the committee's report unanimously called for the Scottish Parliament to have a formal role in relation to agreeing any common frameworks between the Scottish and UK Government. And as we have heard, much of the committee's deliberations on the use of common frameworks took place in late 2018, with the report published in March of this year. A different time, a different Prime Minister, or DEFCON 3, as Patrick Harvey described it earlier. The committee should be commended, therefore, for its ability to work in consensus on this issue. These frameworks will be crucial in a post-Brexit Britain, if we ever get there, because they will provide the necessary structure for working between the 4 administrations. In March of last year, the UK Government published the breakdown of areas which would interact with devolved areas in Scotland. 111 areas of EU law were identified by the UK Government as falling within the devolved competence of the Scottish Parliament, and the committee's evidence therefore focused on 24 of these areas where legislative common frameworks might be needed. As Murdo Fraser has previously mentioned, the committee was of the view that common frameworks must be arrived at through agreement and not imposed upon the Scottish Government. On the UK's internal market, the committee noted the differing approaches across these islands, including those on environmental principles, for example, stating that it will also be important to ensure that there is clarity as to where responsibilities will lie in the future in the environmental field, and that there is no encroachment on devolved competence without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. And ahead of this afternoon's debate, the Royal Society of Edinburgh's written submission pointed to the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee, which warned that without common frameworks, there will be little to prevent a decline in the quality of transboundary natural assets such as air, water and biodiversity, should a future government decide to reduce these protections or not create new targets for improvement. But as the Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell told the committee in February, he said that my understanding is that the devolved settlements allow substantial and sometimes complete policy divergence on key issues, and that an internal market would not override that. Indeed, Scottish Environment Link have highlighted the importance of policy flexibility, considering that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. In their written evidence to the committee, they note that frameworks should act as an ambitious common baseline on top of which individual countries can pursue more ambitious standards. Now, with just 36 days to go until Britain either crashes out without a deal or Mr Johnson somehow manages to arrive at an 11th-hour deal, we are living in different and very difficult political times. Yesterday, my little sister lost out on her honeymoon to Greece, thanks to the supportive UK government that Gordon Lyndhurst described in his contributions. Thousands of holidaymakers across the UK have lost their holidays, thousands more are stranded, and 9,000 jobs and livelihoods are now in very real danger. So we need to talk about the importance of common frameworks because of the Brexit vote. But as we hurtle towards that Halloween deadline, there are yet surely more horrors to unfold. Presiding Officer, it does bear reminding the Chamber of the context of this debate, because common frameworks are not the policy choice of the Scottish Government. They are also not the choice of the Scottish people who voted decisively to remain in 2016. But we all have a responsibility as parliamentarians to ensure that our constituents are protected from the worst excesses of the Brexit vote. That has to be the premise around the establishment of these common frameworks. The committee report concludes by welcoming the progress made with common frameworks on the basis of negotiation and agreement between governments. And as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned previously, and I think Joe McAlpine also, the report points to the Joint Ministerial Committee mechanism, which has been deemed not fit for purpose, and unanimously recommended that Parliament has a formal role in relation to the process for developing, agreeing and implementing both legislative and non-legislative common frameworks. We commit to work with the Scottish Government to develop such processes, and will also work with other parliamentary committees at the Scottish Parliament and across the UK to develop a coordinated approach. But consensus in this Parliament can only bring us so far. In writing to the committee convener in May, David Liddington, then the Minister for the Cabinet Office, said, "The principles of good communication and consultation will remain key to managing our differences, and we are actively building additional support into frameworks in order to bolster dispute avoidance." Given that the current Prime Minister has chosen to unlawfully prorogue the Westminster Parliament, it is somewhat difficult to believe that the spirit espoused by Mr Liddington is that which is going to be emulated by the current administration. Michael Dugan, the Professor of European Law at the University of Liverpool, has said that the UK's newfound single market will be the product of rational and informed choices. Will it be made on the basis of clear and considered options? Will it be decided through inclusive and transparent democratic debate? It appears not. Instead, the UK internal market seems to be evolving through ad hoc discussions and decisions undertaken as part of a wider crisis management strategy conducted largely behind closed doors with minimal public or stakeholder scrutiny. So far, at least, if the UK's chaotic and opaque approach to building a market federation proves sustainable at all, it will surely be more by accident than by design. So today we have heard the ruling from the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. The prorogation of Parliament has been ruled unlawful, and the United Kingdom is now hurtling towards that Brexit cliff edge. Common frameworks will be essential in post-Brexit Britain. I just hope that we don't get there. Thank you.
Claire Baker, followed by Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to thank the Finance and Constitution Committee for taking evidence and preparing this thorough report. The work of our committees in scrutinising and preparing for the work of Parliament in the event of us leaving the EU is vital to preparations and ensuring that Parliament is equipped to carry out its business. As well as the report, can I also thank the committee for the research on models operating in Canada, Germany, Norway and Switzerland. The report was published a few months ago, and it is fair to say we are now in a different situation than we were in March. a different Prime Minister, the promotion of a no-deal exit, the prospect of a general election, and now a Prime Minister who has been found to have acted unlawfully in proroguing Parliament. As the 31st of October gets ever closer, the accountability of Government and the Prime Minister must be enhanced, not avoided. As in several other debates over the last few weeks, today's debate, though, is about raising our eyes above the current political situation and attempting to chart a course through the challenges we are expected to face once the UK is no longer a member of the EU. As a member of the EU, we have followed regulatory processes in common with all other member states. There is agreement between the Scottish, the Welsh and UK Government for common frameworks and a definition and set of principles for reserved and devolved areas agreed by the JMC on EU negotiations. That much has been agreed. There is overlap between common frameworks, the Trade Bill, the Withdrawal Act and the Continuity Bill, all of which have the potential to influence common frameworks. But the lack of progress on reaching a withdrawal deal means that very little has been progressed. As the committee make clear, however, common frameworks will be required with or without a deal. As others have said, there has long been a need for reform of the JMC, but the EU negotiations has stretched its workings to breaking point. It is vital for intergovernmental relationships, and with the advent of common frameworks, it will become increasingly important. As a member of the Interparliamentary Forum on Brexit, reform of intergovernmental workings is a key theme that our members want to see addressed. The devolution settlement has changed and evolved, and yet the JMC remains a body which does not live up to the task. We need a more robust and transparent mechanism that has the confidence of the devolved parliaments. I understand that for a new arrangement to work effectively, there needs to be good terms between parliaments, underpinned by a strong working relationship which is transparent and encapsulates meaningful consultation and decision-making. The agenda for achieving this has been pushed by progress made on the common framework discussions, which call for a mature approach from governments. But as part of a mature approach, and whatever body the common frameworks are managed through, whether it is the JMC or some other incarnation, there is the issue of how to address conflict resolution. There needs to be some kind of mechanism that resolves disputes in a way that is respected by all partners. The RSC are suggesting there's a role for an independent secretariat who could prepare evidence-based decision-making processes which could then facilitate consensus between parliaments. An idea surely worth consideration. It is positive that the committee reports that so far progress on common frameworks has been achieved on the basis of negotiation and agreement between governments. However, this is the early stages, and this Parliament should be clear that finalisation of the actual content must be through agreement and not simply imposed. There is common interest in ensuring the functioning of the UK internal market, but the committee evidence is clear that the clarity needs to be provided on what the UK internal market is and what principles it should embody. The committee's exploration of the complicated area of how to accommodate policy divergence, how to manage public procurement policy, how to provide state aid demonstrates how much is still to be resolved. And the combination of legislative and non-legislative common frameworks raises issues of parliamentary, stakeholder and public scrutiny. The committee make important points about the need for a collaborative approach over the creation of frameworks and the ability for Parliament to scrutinise, and the Scottish Government have given particular assurances. Yet there is a remaining tension between the ability to legislate in future frameworks and a commitment to maintain agreed frameworks, what Bruce Crawford described as constraints. There is a lack of conclusion in all of these discussions, but that is reflective of the political quagmire we find ourselves in. As all attention continues on negotiations, there is a clear lack of capacity to look beyond the current set of circumstances. This is worrying because the stress over the current circumstances is the prospect of crashing out of the EU on the 31st of October, although legislative measures have been taken on a cross-party basis to avoid that, and they must be adhered to, or with prospect of leaving with no deal at some future date. In these circumstances, and leaving with no deal, the need for common frameworks would be urgent, as there would be no cushion of a transition period. This would be very damaging for UK businesses, public services and environmental protections. Presiding Officer, there are many challenges ahead, and I thank the committee very much for interrogating these issues.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On carrying out some research for this afternoon, I came across the Institute for Government's article Common Frameworks, Devolution and Brexit that explains the background to the committee report. The article explained that if the UK leaves the European Union, powers exercised at EU level will be repatriated to the UK. It highlights that much of the EU law intersects with the legislative competence of the devolved institutions. Powers currently exercised by EU institutions will transfer to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in areas such as environmental regulation, agriculture, public procurement and aspects of justice, transport and energy. When the UK leaves the EU, if no changes were made other than to remove the statutory requirement to comply with EU law, these policy areas would fall completely under devolved control, a position that I would prefer. However, if there is a need for common frameworks in certain areas, then it must be by agreement. I note the committee report in conclusion in this area that states we strongly believe that common frameworks must be arrived at through agreement and not imposed. We consider that key to this is resolving by negotiation the extent to which policy divergence can exist within common frameworks. It's also important that if we are to have common frameworks, that there is a role for this Parliament. The committee report says there are a range of reasons why parliamentary scrutiny is considered to be essential to developing effective common frameworks. It enables Parliament to fulfil their scrutiny role in holding government to account for their actions. It enables Parliament to judge between potentially competing interpretations of intergovernmental discussions. Parliament can provide a mechanism by which wider sectorial and stakeholder engagement can be delivered, and Parliament can ensure that making final decisions, the different vested interests are properly balanced. The committee commissioned comparative research on agreement making within the following countries: Canada, Germany, Switzerland and Norway. One interesting point from the research is the situation in Switzerland, where they have a set of guiding principles that, where possible, tasks should be allocated to one single level of government only, and that decisions should be taken as close to the citizens as possible. Where a task cannot be allocated to one level only, then common frameworks come into play. The Swiss political system is orientated towards consensus, where cooperation is the preferred strategy. Hopefully, the UK Government's response to the report is in that spirit of cooperation when it states that the UK Government is committed to working with the devolved administrations to create frameworks that offer stability and certainty to businesses and individuals as decision-making powers return from the EU to Westminster, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. Therefore, Presiding Officer, I will conclude on another of the committee's unanimous recommendations. We strongly agree that the ongoing work to define the UK internal market also respects the devolution settlement, such that enabling the functioning of the UK internal market must not and will not be at the cost of adjusting the devolved competencies without the consent of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament.
We now move to the closing speeches, and I call on James Kelly for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start off by thanking the Finance and Constitution Committee for the work that they have carried out in producing this comprehensive report. I recently left the committee, but I know how much work colleagues, clerks and the various witnesses put into it. Can also put on record my thanks to the convener, Bruce Crawford, for the way he's convened the committee, not just on this issue, but generally, as Murdo Fraser said, he always seeks consensus and seeks to produce expert reports that are underpinned by expert witness, and that's very much the case with this report. It's been quite an unusual day in the events elsewhere have clearly dominated proceedings. As Patrick Harvey said, There's no doubt that the circumstances in which the committee carried out their work in looking at common frameworks are very different then from what they are now. However, there's no doubt that the importance of that work and examining the issues is very much crucial. I think, as Bruce Crawford said, the complexity of the devolution process has developed over time, and there's no doubt that if we were to leave the EU, and I hope that that's not the case, but we need to accept that it is still a reality, then that complexity would increase. As a number of colleagues have pointed out, 111 areas have been identified which are currently covered by EU law, which would then be either all or partially devolved to Scottish Parliament competence. And 24 of those are areas where there's not currently agreement. So it's crucial that there is a body of work in order to ensure that if these common frameworks are going to come into place, they will work adequately. And I think the committee's role in this, in terms of informing Parliament, has been very helpful indeed. One of the issues that's come up from a number of people, Murdo Fraser introduced at the start, was the issue of disputes and disagreements, which will obviously come up where areas of law are being passed and potentially shared between UK and Scottish parliaments. The committee, as others have said, carried out a body of work and visited Brussels and looked at a number of different international examples. And I think there's two things that struck me about it. In terms of resolving disputes, particularly when you spoke to colleagues from Germany and Canada, although there were clearly big political areas of disagreement in both of those countries, in terms of the different levels of government, they were very clear about being able to seek a resolution where there were disagreements, and the culture seemed to be that they should continue to discuss the issues in order to find appropriate solutions. And I suppose that the lesson we must learn from that is that, and this is something for all, not solely the UK Parliament or the Scottish Parliament, we're perhaps a bit too confrontational in these things. And if we're going to find proper resolution in terms of disputes and common frameworks, then we need to there needs to be some change to the culture of our politics. I think, in terms of finding solutions, Willie Rennie and Neil Bibby put forward the idea of qualified voting, and that might help. But certainly we need a structure in place that everybody understands, everybody agrees to. In terms of taking the issues forward, I think one issue that is going to be crucial is funding of these different areas of devolved work. Alec Rowley mentioned, and so did Jenny Gilruth, the briefing from Scottish Environment Link, where currently 80% of the work is basically carried out at EU level, and that's going to come to Scotland. So if that's the case, funding arrangements need to be clear. We need to be clear where the money's coming from, and it needs to be funded fairly so that there's no dilution of current projects. Another feature of the debate has been the lack of progress around the GMC, and indeed a lack of progress around finding solutions to the common frameworks issue. And I think that has been slowed even more since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. I appreciate these are hectic political times, but it doesn't seem to have been a priority for this government. So I think, summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, there are important issues here around common frameworks. Crucially, there needs to be a clear process going forward of scrutiny that involves both parliaments and governments. There needs to be a mechanism for resolving disputes, and also dealing with funding. I think a lot of these issues are touched on in the report, and I think it's helpful in terms of the contribution to the overall debate.
I call Donald Cameron for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I refer to farming in my register of interests? I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this debate, and I thank Bruce Crawford for leading on this report alongside other colleagues on the Finance and Constitution Committee, many of whom have spoken today. It's not often a committee can agree on a report unanimously, and on a day when unanimous decisions are all the rage, the Finance and Constitution Committee should be praised for its consensual approach to this important issue and for the thorough and rigorous examination that it took during committee proceedings to get to this point. And the fundamental point of this report, Deputy Presiding Officer, is an acknowledgement that change is required to reflect the fact that when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, a significant number of powers will be returned to both Westminster and Holyrood, some of which require cooperation. And it is right and proper that we approach this issue in a pragmatic manner, and I feel that the committee have certainly done that in this report. As others have noted, it's clear that the view of business and industry is that appropriate common frameworks and joint working will be essential. The NFUS, for example, has said that regulatory differences must be limited, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, that others have quoted, has said that as the EU frameworks for certain areas of public policy cease to apply, new UK frameworks will have to be evolved to replace them. And most importantly, the Federation of Small Businesses have noted that there will be certain areas where a common UK framework will be desirable, particularly in relation to the integrity of the single market within the UK. And that is an important point. It's been majored on by many speakers. It's a key component of the report in relation to the necessity of common frameworks. And the report notes that common frameworks are necessary to enable the functioning of that market while acknowledging policy divergence. And that latter point is important in my view. Naturally, there will be differences of opinion across the devolved nations. And given that we have a UK-wide parliament and 3 devolved institutions, that is to be expected and respected. However, we must avoid a situation where policy divergence creates any unintended consequences between constituent parts of the UK. And that was a point made by Murdo Fraser. And I concur with the report, which says that by resolving by negotiation the extent to which policy divergence can exist within common frameworks is critical to securing longer-term agreement to those frameworks. And the report notes that the UK and devolved governments have experience of managing policy divergence within the requirements of the EU internal market. So in my view, those experiences should help to ensure that appropriate measures exist to protect the integrity of the UK internal market, which after all is Scotland's most important market, accounting for 3 times the worth of Scottish producers than that of the EU single market. I want to focus on one area where common frameworks are necessary going forward and where appropriate action is being taken to meet this challenge. And again, it's an area that others have spoken about, and that is environmental protection. This was discussed when I sat on the Eclair committee and during various meetings of this chamber with several environmental organisations. And the committee's report, the Finance Committee's report, notes that in 2018, the UK government published the draft environment bill, which proposes a set of environmental principles which will be applied. And the Scottish Government has produced, of course, its own consultation on environmental principles and governance earlier this year. And it is clear that clarity will be required going forward. Like Jenny Gilruth and Alec Rowley, I too was struck by the submission by Scottish Environment Link. They noted that since this report was published, they understand that the UK government and devolved administrations are progressing a 5-phase approach to developing common frameworks across a number of areas relating to the environment. And if that is the case, it's clear that all administrations are taking this matter in particular very seriously, which we strongly welcome. In the remaining time I have, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'd like to briefly highlight some of the other contributions from speakers in this debate. Bruce Crawford, in a typically measured speech, spoke about transparency and how, I think he said, that this must not be solely led by the executive. Parliament must have a formal role in terms of developing and agreeing and implementing common frameworks. And one of the paragraphs that struck me in the report was that, I think it's paragraph 110, which said Parliament and stakeholders have an important role in contributing to and scrutinising common frameworks. And there was a point made by Murdo Fraser, and I think recognised and acknowledged by the Cabinet Secretary in his speech. Murdo Fraser spoke about the Council of Ministers and the fact that there was no separate voice under such a model, proposed model for England, and that was required to be looked at. Gordon Lyndhurst and James Kelly mentioned the importance of mechanisms for resolving conflicts of interests and having the need for good arbitration processes and a constructive approach. And I was struck by what James Kelly said about international comparisons. And however serious a disagreement may be, we do need to change the culture of politics, in particular when trying to reach a fair and consensual result. To conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, I want to reiterate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives our thanks to the committee for the important work that it has done to put together this insightful report. And it's vital that as we leave the EU, all administrations within the UK are able to work cohesively and productively as we take control of the sum £111 held by the EU and begin to set clear policy destinations. And I welcome the fact that both the Scottish Government and the UK Government are already working together on establishing such common frameworks. And I hope the Scottish Government will seek to keep this Parliament informed on this issue as it continues to progress. Thank you.
I now call Michael Russell. If you could give us up to 9 minutes, please, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by commenting on something that Donald Cameron has just said, which is a good place to start in summing up this debate. The report that we are discussing here was a unanimous report. It was a cross-party report. And by and large, the debate here has been consensual in that regard. There is a willingness to work together to try and get this to work. The only discordant note, I have to say, came from Alexander Burnett, which was a very absolutist approach. It must be something genetic, I think, because the reality of the situation is we are trying collectively to make a difference in this matter. Even Willie Rennie, I have to say, whom I think of as the Willie Lomax of this party, really, who is endeavouring to sell something that people have long since decided they don't want, had something constructive to say about the need for constitutional change. So I'm going to try and stress the positive, but against some strong headwinds. And I think it is important because Alec Rowley made the point early on, and it needs to be borne in mind. There are very strong headwinds in this matter. The first of which, I have to say, is to do with the Brexit process itself. I mean, today, and James Kelly has just commented on this, today we are in the midst of even more constitutional chaos. We are so far in uncharted waters that we don't even recognise anything around us. These are strange and unique times in which to be living. I think it's David Allen Green, the commentator, who says that constitutional law, and I'm sure that Mr Tompkins will agree with this, should be boring, and it's dangerous when it becomes exciting. And unfortunately, it has now become exciting. So in all these circumstances, the headwinds have to be taken into account. There is that Brexit process, and it is a complete distraction. And at Whitehall, it is absolutely clear that the vast majority of time, in fact, all the time, is spent on the Brexit process and not on the detail of matters like this. And Mr Kelly is right to have observed that things have slowed down in the new administration and slowed down quite considerably. In fact, there has not been any real discussion of frameworks in that time. There's the issue of funding. You cannot bring in funding frameworks unless you have a suitable funding package. What is going to happen in this is dependent, if these were eventually to take place, on the funding that supports, post-EU funding that supports them. And we have not the faintest idea what that will be. That has not been addressed in any way at all. There's an issue of terms and issues, because sometimes we're talking at cross purposes. There's been lots of discussion today about the UK single market, but John McAlpine has quite correctly quoted Michael Keating on this. There is no agreed definition of that. Devolution allows, in fact, devolution exists to permit a variety of divergence. That is not divergence that is in itself damaging, nor a barrier to trade. I think the example that Damien Green once gave was the difficulty that would be created by having different food regulations for a jam maker in Dundee compared to a jam maker in Durham. The reality is that there is already the flexibility, for example, on issues of sugar content to do that. And that is simply a trading difference. It is not a barrier to trade. So we have differences with terms, and we have the profound difficulty with the intergovernmental review. And I just want to spend a moment or two on that, because it's important that people know where that is at. The very hopeful view that in some sense federalism was just around the corner. It has been a century-long corner, but it's just around the corner, is, I'm afraid, not true. And it's not true because of the UK government. They are not moving on any constitutional issue. The issue of the intergovernmental review was agreed almost 2 years ago in the JMC plenary. Over the period until June this year, virtually nothing happened. A great deal of discussion behind the scenes between civil servants, but virtually no progress. In June this year, at David Liddington's final JMC, held in the margins of the British Irish Council in Manchester, three things were agreed. That the UK government would publish the principles on which the review was taking place. The devolved administration did not wish to be part of that because we agreed these ages ago. We felt that was a false claim to say that in some sense these were new. But there was an agreement, which we were happy to sign on to, that by the end of September there would be a timetable for the intergovernmental review, and by the end of December there would be detailed proposals. I have to say we are almost at the end of September and we have seen no timetable. 2 weeks ago, the new Paymaster General proposed that the discussion of the intergovernmental review be removed from the JMC process in the JMC-EN and become a matter for trilaterals between Wales, Scotland and the UK, and that would feed into a JMC plenary at a as yet unspecified date. I think that it was important to reflect, as the Welsh Minister and I myself did to him, that the control of JMC agenda should not be solely for one part of the process. And it is now agreed that the JMC-EN will consider those parts that deal with Brexit, and there will also be trilaterals going ahead. There has not yet been a trilateral. I think there has been daddy issues more than anything else. But we are not really in a position to say that any progress has been made by the intergovernmental review. So if we are looking to the intergovernmental review as a foundation for frameworks, then we have a very long way to go. But other issues have made progress. I think it is quite clear from Mr. Crawford's opening remark and my responses in my opening remarks that there are things happening. And on the issue of scrutiny, there is substantial amounts happening. I wrote to the committee earlier this year in response to this report on the 2nd of August, and I made the point that the scrutiny issue was very much in our mind, and I said this at the bottom of page 3. I would reiterate my previously stated view that there is a need for parliaments to have a role in developing, agreeing and implementing all frameworks, and the arrangements put in place should ensure that the necessary time and information is provided to allow for effective scrutiny to take place in advance of the final agreement of any framework. I don't think I could have been clearer than that. The Scottish Government welcomes the involvement of the Parliament in not just drawing up the frameworks, but in scrutinising them and operating them, and we will take those forward. So those are the major issues that have been taking place in the debate today, but I want to make two final points. The Scottish Government will continue to work on frameworks in cooperation with the other partners, but not if frameworks are imposed. I think that has to be crystal clear. If there is an attempt to impose frameworks through the Section 12 process, we will not cooperate on them. And that is the right thing to do, because they can only work if they have been agreed to. And finally, can I just make the point that it would be best for all of us if these frameworks were not needed? And I believe that. I believe it would be far better if we had a different system. But let us look across the Irish Sea to a different type of framework that operates. The framework of EU relations with the UK has supported Ireland tremendously well over the last 3.5 years. And I would much rather that we were in the position where we were part of those frameworks and our relationships one to the other governed by those frameworks and enforceable at law. That would be the best way to operate, and it requires us to be an independent nation.
I now call Adam Tompkins, who's closing for the committee, and around 10 minutes would take us up to decision time, Mr Tompkins, which this evening is at 5:10.
Up to 10 minutes, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think is what you normally tell me. Presiding Officer, this has been a fascinating day to be a constitutional lawyer in politics. Although, and I mean no disrespect to anybody who's spoken in this afternoon's debate, the principal reason for that fascination has not been common frameworks. Before the summer recess, Presiding Officer, I gave an interview to Holyrood magazine in which I said that if I had a time machine, I would go back to 1642. The year, not the time, the year 1642. And I said that because I wanted to witness how constitutional conflict between Crown prerogative and the will of Parliament is resolved. Well, strike that interview from the record, Presiding Officer, because that's exactly what the Supreme Court ruled on this morning. Now, I don't know whether the Constitution of 1642 featured common frameworks. Perhaps Stuart Stevenson and others who were there at the time can tell us. But the post-Brexit UK Constitution of 2019 will certainly need common frameworks. We didn't need them, Presiding Officer, before we joined the European Union in 1972, because in those days there was no devolution in the United Kingdom. But whatever form it eventually takes, Brexit cannot mean that we return to the Constitution of 1972. And we have not needed common frameworks while we've been a member state of the European Union, because the policy areas that they concern, or that they will concern, fall within the legal competence of the EU. Now, it's welcome, I think, Presiding Officer, and it's not to be taken for granted, but it is welcome that both the UK and Scottish governments have not merely acknowledged, but have accepted the need for common frameworks. Unionist ministers in London have accepted that policy divergence will be a feature of the United Kingdom internal market post-Brexit, as indeed it already is. And nationalist ministers in Scotland have likewise accepted that this policy divergence cannot extend so far as to damage the integrity of the UK-wide marketplace, on which, as we have heard, Scottish business and Scottish consumers rely so much. And that is all welcome. Now, a number of SNP members said, and I think he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Cabinet Secretary himself said that they did not really want common frameworks because, of course, they don't want Brexit. To which I would just gently point out that if Scotland were ever to become an independent country, Scotland would need a whole slew of common frameworks with the rest of the United Kingdom. But be that as it may, common frameworks, Presiding Officer, may be new for us, but the issues they will govern are completely normal for mature federal democracies, or, if you don't like the F word, for mature democracies with multi-layered government. What policy divergence at state level can be accommodated within the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution is a bread-and-butter issue for the US Supreme Court. And how the division of legislative and executive competence between the provinces of Canada and the federal government in Ottawa impacts on the integrity of Canadian economic regulation is a matter that appears routinely in the docket of the Supreme Court of Canada. Happy to give way.
Stuart Stevenson. I'm very interested in what the member is saying, but how does he resolve the very fundamental difficulty there is that our poor neighbours in England have no independent representation in their own legislature, and that therefore the state parliament is conflicted and schizophrenic in the way it has to deal with the devolved administrations?
Adam Tompkins.
Well, I think we resolve that in the way that the British Constitution always resolves these kinds of difficulties, which is pragmatically and in an uncodified way. And as it is for the US Supreme Court and as it is for the Supreme Court of Canada, I think, Presiding Officer, so it will prove to be here. As both Murdo Fraser and Willie Rennie said in their interesting speeches, this is about how our Constitution navigates the sharing of power, or cooperation, as Willie Rennie put it, between two layers of government. And Willie Rennie was absolutely right, by the way, to say that we would need to be thinking about this even without Brexit. But I'm sure he will agree with me that Brexit just means that it's all the more vital and important that we get on with it. Which brings me to IGR, intergovernmental relations. And here, Presiding Officer, I confess to something of a frustration. Many speakers, including the Cabinet Secretary, said, quite rightly in my view, that the UK's intergovernmental relations are not fit for purpose. That's become the go-to phrase that people use on these occasions. But none of them, not even the Cabinet Secretary, bothered to identify what they thought their purpose is. Isn't it clear, Presiding Officer, that taking the sharing of power seriously, as common frameworks invite us to do, means that our intergovernmental, and I'm very happy to give way to the Cabinet Secretary on this in a minute, I can see he's itching, means that our intergovernmental machinery must develop into a system that allows governments not only to meet and discuss items of mutual interest, but to take decisions jointly. In my view, this needs to happen. Do you want to intervene at this point? Or do you... No. Well, let me finish the point then, and then I'll take the intervention if you still want to make one, Cabinet Secretary. But the convener, Bruce Crawford, was quite right to point out the very serious challenges that this entails, not least for transparency. There needs to be effective joint decision-making, But there also needs to be effective parliamentary oversight and scrutiny of such decision-making processes.
I'm not going to disagree with a single word of that. I would ask the member to perhaps look at the contribution I made to the Institute for Government 3 months ago, in which I made these points. Mark Drakeford made the same points from Wales, and we will shortly publish our own paper on these matters. There will be a substantial contribution to it, and I have referenced with approval the Welsh paper 18 months ago. So nobody disputes those points. Those things are on the table. The problem is the UK Government has brought nothing to the table.
Well, I welcome the contribution that the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government, and indeed also the Welsh Assembly, are making to this. I think those contributions are vital. Also, I would say this, that I mean, it's a bit of a mouthful, Presiding Officer, but there's this thing called the Interparliamentary Brexit Forum. And the Interparliamentary Brexit Forum meets quarterly. It rotates between Scotland, Wales and London. And it brings together the conveners and deputy conveners, the chairs and the vice chairs of all of the key parliamentary committees in this Parliament, in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords and in the Welsh Assembly to discuss matters of mutual concern. One of the things that we've said is that intergovernmental relations are not fit for purpose and that interparliamentary relations are even worse. Well, that last bit of that sentence needs to be rewritten because interparliamentary relations in the UK are now beginning to bear fruit, and the Interparliamentary Brexit Forum is the prime example of that, it seems to me. Now, in a speech that contained what I thought were a number of useful insights, Patrick Harvey said that the UK is not the EU. The UK is not an intergovernmental organisation, and we cannot just copy and paste the structures of the European Union and transplant them onto the UK. Now, I agree with that. But one area where perhaps we can learn from the EU is in the use of principles such as proportionality and subsidiarity. We will need, Presiding Officer, some basic constitutional principles to navigate between the integrity of the UK internal market, on the one hand, and reasonable policy or regulatory divergence on the other. Proportionality, yeah, happy to give way.
Patrick Harvey. Grateful to the member for giving way. How does he believe that under the scenario he's outlining, the power of the UK government can be constrained so that it is not in future able to do things which require the consent of devolved administrations or parliaments without that consent being in place?
Intervention. I'm just going to come on to offer one personal solution to it. Whether it's a solution that will be accepted by the committee or not, we'll have to see. But the proportionality and subsidiarity as matters of EU law are two such principles. That's to say, there are two principles that can be and are used to navigate this dispute between the integrity of markets on the one hand and reasonable policy divergence on the other. And I, for one, although I stress that this is my view, Presiding Officer, and not the committee's, I'm not squeamish about thinking of these principles as matters of law for courts to enforce in cases of dispute. And to address Patrick Harvey's perfectly reasonable question, we've seen just today that the United Kingdom Supreme Court emphatically has the power to impose its judgments on the UK government. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, this has, I think, been a genuinely useful debate that has shone light on important aspects of the way in which Brexit will have to be delivered compatibly with our devolution settlement, whilst at the same time necessarily changing key aspects of that settlement. I'd like to thank all of the speakers who've taken part in this afternoon's debate and all of the members and especially the clerks of the Finance Committee for their contributions to the report that we've been debating this afternoon. And most importantly, I'd like to support the motion in the name of my friend Bruce Crawford.
Thank you very much, Mr Tompkins. That concludes the Finance Constitution Committee debate on its report on common frameworks. And we'll move on to the next item of business, which is decision time, which is slightly early, but I think... We don't remember can we move decision time till now? Yes, good. There's one question. The question is that motion 18951 in the name of Bruce Crawford on report on common frameworks be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. And we're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Colin Smith on Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis Week 2019. But we'll just wait a few moments for members to change seats and ministers to change seats. Short pause.